In this video, we will cover what it means to define a function, call that function, and even pass it some arguments to use in its execution. So here we have a simple program that will use a function to calculate wages, including overtime pay. After the initial greeting, we define a function called computePay using the def command and declare two parameters that will be used to receive the data we send to the function. A parameter is just a receiving spot for data that we send it. We'll see more on that in a bit. We then define what we want to do inside the function. It is important to pay attention to the indentation of each line, as that is one way Python determines how to group commands. If we define a function that has or needs no parameters, we call that a void function. It will just execute what is defined in the function and do nothing else. Now that we have defined our computePay function, let's get some keyboard input. Here we ask the user for the number of hours worked and store the input into a variable called HRS. Then we ask the user for the rate of pay and store it in a variable called RT. After storing the input variables, we want to convert them to floating point values because we will be working with numbers that include decimals. Speaking, of course, about dollars and cents. Notice that when we use the function called float, which does the conversion for us, we then store the result in a new variable, in this case hours and rate. You can use any legal variable name, but for this program it makes sense to use hours and rate for purposes of readability. You could use something like day and night as variables, but doing so would not help the reader understand what our intention is. Notice we also create another variable where we calculate any hours over 40 and store the results in a variable called OT. When we call the function will do its thing and then return the results of any calculation, so we need to declare a variable where we want that return value stored. In this case, we will use the variable name pay, which makes sense. Now we call the function. We do that by using the function name followed by the data we want to send to the function called arguments. Here we want to send the arguments, which consist of the contents of the variables hours and rate. Notice how we enclose them in parentheses as part of the function name and separate them using a comma. Take note, and this is important, that when we call a function and pass it arguments, we use the same number of arguments to match the parameters defined in the function definition. If they are in effect the same thing, why do we call one a parameter and the other an argument? That goes to clarity and communication. When I say arguments, that means I am speaking of data being sent. Conversely, when I say parameters, I am speaking of the variable that will receive the contents of the argument being sent. So for this program, I am sending the arguments hours and rate to the parameters time and wait. Now it's time to get to work and execute the code we defined in the function definition so we can calculate the total pay. Notice that here we use the variables time and wage instead of hours and rate to make our calculations. Once the total pay is calculated, we use the return command to return the results of the function calculations back to the variable pay that we declared when we called the function. So now the variable pay contains the result stored in the function variable total pay. Then we display to the user the total pay for the week. The first thing we do is use an if statement to check if there were any overtime hours involved. If there were overtime hours, we print a statement indicating how many hours were overtime and what the hourly rate was for those hours along with the total pay. Otherwise, we just print the total pay. Notice that we used the pay variable for the output. If you tried to use the variable total pay, the program would not recognize the variable because the scope of total pay is only inside the function where it was declared.